Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Fortet, Parallel. Okay, so I should hope we're all familiar with Kieran Hebden. I've covered his stuff twice before with his New Energy and 16 Oceans albums. Links to both of those reviews are in the description. We'll probably do a proper series on him at some point eventually, though I don't know when. You may recall that 16 Oceans in particular was marked as my number 3 favorite album of last year. I thought it was one of his strongest, most interesting and engaging projects in the better part of a decade. And New Energy, well, back when I reviewed it, I was massively disappointed by it and considered it his weakest album yet, but it has since really clicked with me, and I now consider it one of his better projects as well. Now, I've said before that this guy is the kind of artist where once he releases a new album, I immediately scramble to get my hands on it. Which brings us to this album in particular, which he dropped with pretty much no prior warning or build-up on this past Christmas Day, alongside an archive compilation called 871. While I did pretty immediately purchase and download both of these projects, something kinda felt off to me about them that wasn't driving nearly as much excitement as either New Energy or 16 Oceans. Perhaps because they were released in such close proximity to his last album, and with so little build-up, and on Christmas no less, when I was obviously busy putting together my year-end list. Oh, and the fact that neither album had any actual track titles. They were just like Jean-Michel Jarre-style numbering parts of the same whole. I also found out later that half the tracks on this project were previously released on an old side project alias he started up a few years ago that's impossible to pronounce because it's all like weird wingding characters. Though half of it was new original material as well. And given I consider his Pink project to be a mainline album of his, despite technically being a compilation of singles he'd already released before, I didn't feel like I had any excuse not to call this a main album as well. Just, something about this project gave me the feeling that I was not going to be getting, say, like a Run the Jewels 3 level effort out of Hebden this time around. And sure enough, after listening to it, Parallel is an album that reads to me more as like a side project and a bonus offering. Something that Hebden probably didn't have as much personal investment in or put a lot of thought into. It doesn't really show him doing anything new he hasn't already done before, doesn't show any of his best work to date. It feels very thrown together and even kinda rushed. More like a collection of random tracks that he just had lying around that don't really service each other or come together in a cohesive work. Gonna be brutally honest, if I have to consider Parallel a mainline Fortet album, then it's probably my least favorite one of his so far. But at the same time, I also didn't feel that same sense of, disappointment that I felt when New Energy first dropped. Like I said, I didn't go into this expecting it to be anything special or mind-blowing, and it is still all enjoyable for what it is. If it's his worst project, it's not by, a long shot or anything. It's a fine enough addition to a back catalog that doesn't have any outright duds or projects that I would consider below 7 range. And this project would technically have somewhat of its own identity to set itself apart from previous Fortet projects. Not sound design-wise. In that department, it just sounds like some mix of several different sounds he's explored since the days of Beautiful Rewind. I guess with more of a focus on ambient material. But Parallel is notable for the fact that everything feels a lot less structured and a lot more free-flowing than any of his previous projects. These pieces almost feel like they could have been improvised or made out of jam sessions. Tracks run on pretty long and constantly meander wherever the heck they like without much of a sense of direction. And I suppose it is also notable for its opening track, which, I'll admit, I can't think of any album I've heard before off the top of my head that starts with a 26-minute ambient piece. I've heard quite a few that end with long ambient pieces, but starting with one and then proceeding with an otherwise normally paced album from there, I mean, that definitely breaks the mold. Now, I'm not sure if this move actually works to the album's benefit. First of all, the piece itself is not actually that notable. It reminds me a lot of his track LA Trance from his New Energy album. Pretty much just a set of sparse, plinking synth melodies that meander around, don't really go anywhere all that interesting. There's one moment, 18 minutes in or so, where the melodies randomly switch to a faster tempo for a little bit that can grab my attention, and the glitched up phone messages at the very beginning are kind of a neat touch as well. And everything else is nice for what it just doesn't really feel designed to be paid closer attention to or have much depth or dimensionality. Not to mention, placing it at the front of the album makes the pacing of the whole project feel really lopsided and sloppy. This first track feels disconnected from everything else going on here. Like, it doesn't even feel like it's part of the album. Like, you got Parallel 1 and then you got the rest of the album. I don't think I would mark it as my least favorite part of the album. Like, it was actually a really nice track to just zone out to, and definitely felt like an interesting move that gave me stuff to say. But, you know, it's not exactly on the same level as, say, the long meandering pieces on Morning Evening. And as for the remainder of the album, it can be a pretty big mixed bag. There are definitely some highlights, like the micro house outings and vocal chops of Parallel 4 may have sounded like a cross between his old tracks Daughter and Baby, but was still enjoyable in the same ways. I definitely enjoyed that one whenever it came up. The various layered cascades of plinking bells of Parallel 6 sorta remind me of something that might have shown up on There's Lovin' You, and the ambient progressions of Parallel 7 I thought went very well over its sparse microhouse progressions, one of the more emotional high points of this project for me. Kinda reminds me of something like You Are Loved, but the lonely piano meanderings of Parallel 9 were probably the single biggest high point for me, as they go up against various field recordings and then some slowly building minimal synths and beats and even some vibraphones and like subtle cellos that give the whole track a much more refreshing and layered feel. That track was excellent. But at the same time, you also got tracks like Parallel 8, which has a sparse microhouse beat and some plucked trance-ish chords that had this very minimal vibe to everything. Mainly just came off to me as a little dull and uninspired. I'd much rather listen to a track of his like SW99SL that pulls off the same sort of vibe much more effectively. Parallel 2 similarly just gave me nothing but deja vu for previous Fortet offerings. Its minimal pad progressions and typical garage house beat just sounded like plenty of other tracks I've heard from him before, and not sticking out as anything special. And the closer, Parallel 10, sounded like two different disconnected tracks that didn't make sense as being the same piece, with the first half having all these dreamy synth melodies that I suppose kind of mirror the opener, but later randomly cutting into a stretch of plinky pianos that sound like a little kid playing on a keyboard, attempting to create a mood but mostly just hitting random keys. It's pleasant, but I don't know, it just feels a little anticlimactic for an ending. Oh yeah, and there's also two little interludes in Parallel 3 and Parallel 5 that don't do much besides add a few little synth melodies and bells and stuff. I almost never actually notice they're playing when they come up, and they're over so quickly that they may as well not even be there. But I guess they're cool too, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you guys. This project is perfectly fine, inoffensive stuff with plenty of refreshing and or meditative vibes that you can always count on Hebden to pull off effectively, but it also very transparently reads to me as him not bringing his A game. It feels like a bunch of leftovers thrown together ad nauseum and more like a side project than something that fully lives up to the consistency of his previous back catalog. Very much hit a similar note for me that last Outtaker album Plus did. Which, first of all, I do have more respect for that project, since even when those guys are delivering a bunch of their C-tier material, Sean Booth and Rob Brown still have that insanely high watermark of technical ability and creativity. Each of the tracks individually clearly had enough effort put into them, even if they wouldn't always fully interest me. But what really bugged me about that album was the lack of thought put into the pacing and sequencing, and the way that none of those tracks would coalesce together to form a greater whole, that made the whole thing stink of a side project, the kind of thing that wouldn't have struck me as main album material if they hadn't advertised it as such. Exact same deal with Parallel. Fortet does probably have a higher baseline level of personal enjoyment for me than Outtaker. This album didn't have any moments that were, like, tedious to get through, and I'll always enjoy the vibe that he can create with his music, even in his lowest effort moments. But this just very clearly read to me as a lower effort project from him. I'll tell you what, though, say what you will about Parallel, this album was definitely better than the other project he put out on the same day, 871. Like, I won't mince words, 871 was just flat out not good. It was a collection of material from before he had any professionally recorded output and was most likely broke and couldn't afford good recording equipment, and boy does it show. Like, think Boards of Canada's Random 35 Tracks tape if that project were really boring. Lots of experimental synth doodles with no tune and crappy sounding guitar pieces, with sporadically a nice track that does sorta hint at the kind of talent he actually had, but mostly just a big slog all around. There were maybe like 3-4 tracks that were worth anything to me. I want to say track 7 and a few others near the back half that were nice. And it's nice as like a curiosity to show that, hey, even a high-profile, well-known artist like Kieran Hebden was once a complete nobody. could be inspirational to all you obscure Bandcamp artists out there that you can eventually grow to become something bigger with enough work and refinement. That didn't actually make this fun for me to listen to, though. I can't give it my recommendation. I'd be feeling like a solid 4 if I were to score it. Parallel, if nothing else, definitely fits much better in Four Tet's back catalog than 871 does. I'm not opposed to the idea of calling this a main album, and did still enjoy myself in all the ways I would expect to enjoy myself when listening to a new project from Four Tet. It's certainly worth giving a shot if you're as big a fan of this guy as I am. Just, don't go in expecting anything particularly mind-blowing or out of the box for him. He's got lots of better stuff, but it's still pretty decent, I guess, so I think I'm overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.